Děkuji. Já se omlouvám se, ale budu mluvit anglicky, protože budu citovat autora, který to napsal anglicky, abych ne všechno překládala, jsem si to všechno napsal anglicky. On 9th of November 1989, from 6 to 8 p.m., I was attending the regular class of Professor Alfred Grosser at Sciences Po University in Paris. He was explaining to our eager ears that the situation in Berlin was developing at such a pace that nothing was predictable, and he could not possibly say what would happen within the next 2 weeks. But the end of communism in East Germany was not on people's minds. Everyone was still rather expecting some kind of perestroika. And then, at 7:15, the director of our school made a dramatic entrance in front of us from the emergency exit. "Dear Alfred," he said, "the East German authorities have just announced that the passage to the west is now open." For me, like for everyone else in the room, it was first of all a great emotional moment, a massive joy, and the feeling the wind of history had just swept us. But what I would like to insist upon here is the extent to which it was a major surprise, East and West. None of my professors expected this, but also no one in Berlin, Prague, or anyone else. Not the Communist Party, not the population, not the students, not the dissidents. Even after it had already started, people still couldn't believe that this will lead to an immediate regime change. Karel Bartošek, the Czech historian, was interviewed by French TV on 20th of November, 3 days after the revolution started. "The change will probably come," he said. "It might take a year, but it will probably come," even though the revolution was already in full swing. Václav Havel was also taken by surprise and thoroughly unprepared to lead the country. He was interviewed on 27th of November after 10 exciting but hectic days, and he said he could still help as a writer, but it was time the real people, praví lidé, took over and led the revolution professionally. He still thought of himself and of the other dissidents as being there by chance and only provisionally. But the problem was, and it was to be made clear as early as in the following 2 weeks, there were no real people around. There were no professional politicians ready to take over from the communist regime. There was no one around who was prepared and who knew how to do this. If there was a revolution today, it's as if we didn't know what to do, and we would decide, okay, Jiří Suk will be interior minister, and Michal Pullman will be minister of culture, and Tomáš Vilimek will be foreign minister. And that's pretty much the way it happened. Since state socialism constrained the development of a class of private entrepreneurs and proprietors in Central Europe, it is the cultural bourgeoisie, the dissident intellectuals, who assumed the historic mission of creating bourgeois society and the capitalist economic order. And then all of a sudden, within a couple of years, there developed what was called abroad, especially by Jacques Rupnik, who was fond of this, the so-called Czech paradox. The country that had had the most powerful Communist Party all of a sudden was the country leading the strongest lustration policy. This is something he and most other commentators were really at odds to explain, and they never really managed. And shortly after that, even, the country was divorcing, and Slovakia separated, which again is something that took commentators completely by surprise, since Havel was so respected and he was against the breakup. So why did all of this happen? I chose to present to you today the thesis developed by Israeli-American political scientist called Gil Eyal, who, in my opinion, did not get the recognition he deserved in the Czech Republic, even though his analysis of the Velvet Revolution is very interesting and thought-provoking. And his book brought him a prize in the US and later on a professorship at Columbia, but he remains largely unknown here. Even though he developed his analysis at the end of the 1990s, that is only 10 years after the revolution, his approach is up to date with the latest research trend coming from Germany that is called the Lange Wende. Our friends at the Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung in Potsdam are indeed at the forefront of a new approach that decided to consider the 1989 events in a wider time context, that is, not study just 1989, but study the period from 1980 to the year 2000. Gil Eyal similarly retraces the origin of what happened during the Velvet Revolution to the aftermath of the Prague Spring, And he shows its consequences both onto the Czechoslovak breakup and onto the upcoming attitude towards the communist past that we still experience today. So how does his argument go? In his book, The Origins of Post-Communist Elites, From the Prague Spring to the Breakup of Czechoslovakia, that came out in 2003, he argues, sorry, I lost my stuff. He argues that the main process leading to the split of Czechoslovakia was a struggle between Czech and Slovak fractions who represented alternative visions of post-communist society and of the role of intellectuals within it, including during the Velvet Revolution. His explanation for the breakup of Czechoslovakia focuses on the bipolar elite constellation that endowed the two elites, Czechs and Slovaks, with distinctive political rationalities within which the dissolution of the common state became a reasonable solution. His starting point is an argument developed by some Czech and Slovak intellectuals in 1993 after the breakup of Czechoslovakia. These intellectuals suggested that the conflict between the Czech and Slovak post-communist elites and the subsequent decision to dissolve the federation could be traced to the events that followed the crashing of the Prague Spring in August 1968. Indeed, after the Soviet invasion, the newly installed leaders of Czechoslovakia conducted purges against the reformers, but these purges proceeded differently in the two republics. With Moscow's blessing, party leaders persecuted the Czech elite and intelligentsia quite harshly, while they were more lenient with respect to the Slovak elite. The result was that the Czech intelligentsia was pushed into dissent, while the Slovak one compromised and collaborated with the communist regime. So when the regime collapsed in 1989, this meant a fateful difference in the makeup of post-communist elites. In the Czech Republic, there was no alternative. There was an alternative to replace the discredited communist elites. And that was the available counter-elite of former dissidents, such as Havel. So a complete turnover of elites was possible. In Slovakia, there was no alternative elite, and the new post-communist elite included many former communists, as well as men of 1968, such as Alexander Dubček, who were involved in the attempts to reform communism in the past. Eyal quotes Jožka Skalník, who underlined the paradox of a state that disintegrated even though the majority of its citizens favored its continuance. But Eyal's argument is that this breakup was no incomprehensible accident. It was the theatricalized representation of the conflicts of post-communist society, conflicts that in Poland and Hungary, for instance, led to the return of post-communist parties to power in 1994. The federation split because of the clash between the interests and worldviews of the Czech and Slovak post-communist elites, who were shaped by radically incongruous experiences and trajectories, the same radically incongruous experiences and trajectories that had already shaped the Velvet Revolution. So what happened during the revolution? In the course of the negotiations, says Eyal, the dissidents, led by Havel, discovered that the group of reform communists from the socialist opposition group, going by the name of Obroda, Revival, were conducting a parallel set of negotiations with the regime. Suspecting that this was a ploy to split the opposition, the dissidents reacted angrily and refused to include Obroda members in the new government of national reconciliation. Exasperated, they declared that the reform communists were perhaps worthy of rehabilitation, but that they were utterly incapable of holding key positions in the present conjuncture, since they were insiders and symbols of 1968. Put differently, to maintain their monopoly over symbolic political capital, the dissidents developed a discursive strategy involving a complete rejection of the communist past, to such an extent that anybody associated with it, even as a reformer or as a critic, was immediately suspect. And of course, they did not realize that this argument would soon come back to haunt them. I would add to what Eyal says that Czech dissidents' position in society was weak in November 1989. They were unknown to the wider public outside of Prague, even Havel, and their sole political legitimacy, the only justification of the fact that they were allowed to negotiate with the regime and to represent the country against the communist leaders, was because they had been fighting against the regime, that they had been anti-communist fighters. So to gain and to keep power, to prevent reform communists from having any influence, Their only argument was anti-communism. In this, they very much differed from Slovak dissidents, who wanted, on the contrary, to include Obroda, because Obroda members were much more popular in Slovakia than they were. And that is why, continues Eyal, Czech dissidents went to seek economic experts like Václav Klaus. They needed such experts who would not and could not become allies of the reform communists, and they could not threaten their hold on symbolic power. Indeed, without being invited by the dissidents, the monetarist economists could not have laid claim to belonging to the opposition. The zealous protection of their status as opposition during the roundtable negotiations guaranteed that the dissidents would enter the new post-communist period as holders of a symbolic power to represent society as its delegates. This power was immediately converted into a dominant position in the post-communist political field, at least in the Czech part of the country. So by 1992, there were only two ideological packages left in the country, the Czech right and the Slovak left. And that is why the breakup made sense for the leaders of each part, if not for the people. Once he helped move aside the reform communists by being co-opted, Klaus's problem became how to fight the dissidents for political power. The solution was to split the dissident community in the emerging division between liberals and conservatives. The struggle was not over the meaning of the past. Instead, it turned into a debate over how best to deal with the sins of the past, whether the emphasis should be on confession or penance, that is, on expose and understand, perhaps even forgive, or on exclude, punish, and condemn. The liberal dissidents, like Havel, says Eyal, emphasized the theme of universal guilt, that is, the notion that under communism the whole population was co-opted by the regime and that therefore everybody was complicit in the crimes of communism. At the same time, they also emphasized the purifying power of confession. In the sense, they strove to become pastors for the whole Czech nation and thereby maintain a firmly anti-political position in the political field. They wanted to be involved in politics without becoming stained by such involvement. They wanted to expand symbolic capital and even to accumulate more. Klaus and the conservative dissidents, on the other hand, campaigned for what came to be known as lustration. They explicitly rejected the thesis of universal guilt and turned it back at its formulators. I'm quoting Václav Klaus in 1990 in Respect. It was not we who did this. None of us would ever have had the audacity, for we do not know this type of ambition. Behind every arrogant attempt to draw up completely new social institutions, there lurks the cerebral and sometimes physical violence of a handful of self-important intellectuals. And as we know, this kind of very anti-Havel narrative continues until today in Václav Klaus's mouth. Thus, because of the way the repression was led after the Prague Spring, because of the fact that the dissidents had only the anti-communist card to play and needed to get rid of the reform communists, and because of the power struggle between dissidents in the new transition and Klaus's involvement in it, the need for lustration was born, and lustration meant that specific culprits would now substitute for universal guilt. As early as the first weeks of 1990, it became clear that instead of questioning its own massive involvement with communism, the Czech nation would denounce and condemn one certain category of people, and one alone, those who had collaborated with the STB, and who were now destined to pay for everyone. Sure enough, it was only a few months before Cibulka started to publish his list of alleged collaborators to the secret police. Bad luck for those who were on the list, and even worse luck for those who were on the list but were partly or entirely innocent. They're all agents, I was told many times in the past 20 years, when I objected that this kind of moral pillorying that waved away any external circumstances or contextualization seemed hardly fair. In fact, and after dozens of prominent people were publicly denounced in this way, it is only with the recent case of Pavel Vonka, a dissident who has just recently been accused in the same flippant way to have been a secret police collaborator, that this conservative dissident camp and their heirs came to finally argue that STB files didn't mean anything, that they could not be taken at face value, and that the contextualization was necessary. So perhaps this is at long last a fitting circumstance to celebrate the 25 years since the fall of communism. So anyway, instead of voluntary confession and soul-searching, we got since 1990 communist-style screening and a democratic version of the good old purges. And instead of absolution, we got penance in the form of a fixed form of excommunication, that is lustration and the impossibility to work in certain functions. But this exit strategy from communism also implied that the power to condemn and absolve would be usurped from the dissidents and turned against them by whomsoever controlled the mechanisms of screening. Lustration was a powerful weapon, not only against the reform communists, but also against the dissidents, since their names were constantly mentioned in the STB files as candidates for recruitment as informers. And the dissidents had nothing but their word to counter accusation that they had collaborated, since the archives were closed. Sure enough, it didn't take long for Cibulka to accuse Havel of having worked, and perhaps even still work, for the communists when he was already president. So, as Bill Eyal summarizes it, the political strategy of the right in the Czech Republic forged an ideological package centered on the symbolic imperative to reject and condemn the past. Despite the struggles between the monetarist economists and liberal and conservative dissidents, they all joined in the idiom of condemnation of the past because they shared an enemy in the reform communists, and they merged in the rituals of purification because they shared a privileged position in post-communist society. Together, they justified this privileged position as a pastoral leadership who needed to extirpate a nation of sinners from their condition of internal enslavement and lead them through sacrifice to the promised land of civil society. So the conclusion is obvious. It is not because of anti-communist resistance to the communist regime. It's not because it was so strong that the Czech Republic developed the most severe lustration policy of all communist countries, a policy that contributed in a major way to its breakup from Slovakia. It is on the contrary because this anti-communist resistance was so weak. The way the revolution was led was an overcompensation destined to reinforce the political legitimacy of the formerly dissident turned post-communist elite. The work we still have to do today is hence to study how this totalitarian rule was possible, not just to document it and to condemn it as an abstract evil. The persistence of a radical anti-communist movement 25 years later is achieving quite nothing quite so productive. On the contrary, its presence is a continued testimony to the weakness of the opposition to communism and of the desperate urge to justify the need to keep in power ex-conservative dissidents as well as Václav Klaus's supporters and their heirs. That is, this movement is justifying actual political battles instead of reflecting a genuine desire to deal with the country's communist past. This political ploy is losing much of its appeal anyway, for three reasons. First is that hardly anyone, least of all the new generations, believes the story anymore that everything under communism was bad and everything democratic is good. On the contrary, people increasingly express the need for this soul-searching and confessing attitude that was denied to them after 1990. And while historians are still hesitant, filmmakers, writers, and television programs leave no doubt to the fact that people are ready and willing to listen to the other side of the story and to make their own, much more moderate judgment. Second reason is maybe as late as 10 years ago, I would probably have argued that whatever its origins and debatable moral background, the lustration was perhaps not so bad. At least our Polish and Hungarian neighbors envied it, and they envied, in particular, how the former secret police and Communist Party high-ranking members did not get their hands on the states. But considering how our democracy developed, and considering the unenviable level of corruption and the sickening level of part of the Czech post-communist political elites and media, I think the Czech Republic has not been much of a model to anyone in terms of moral behavior. And the third reason why this political ploy is not working so well anymore is the unfortunate failure of the post-dissident program that is now revealing itself in full. And I would insist on the fact that it is in a way no one's fault. The dissidents were not prepared for this, as I abundantly showed, and there was no reason why they should have been. But the Havelian project to promote decency as a political program, as admirable as it was on the personal level, proved inefficient in real life. As Avise Tucker put it in a recent article in Forbes, the end of communism was sudden and unexpected. The essence of dissidence was personal moral integrity and decency in the face of a bullying state and opportunistically compromising society. The extent of the dissidents' political plan was that people would become decent. The edifice of a moral state could be built on the ruins of tyranny. Liberal democracies, by contrast, continues Tucker, are founded on good institutions, designed to turn human vices into virtues. Hunger for power, greed and corruption can be turned into public virtues if channeled through constitutionally well-designed institutions. Unfortunately, says Tucker, the dissident response to corruption was individual decency, not institutional designs. Without the institutions of the rule of law in societies demoralized by accommodation to tyranny, moralizing homilies appeared ineffective remedies to the corrective power of the post-communist elite. So this is why Germany happily celebrated the 25 years since the fall of the wall this weekend, while Czech social networks coined the slogan, "Není co slavit," there is nothing to celebrate. What really made the difference between the former GDR and the rest of the post-communist world, what turned it into a full success instead of the half success that we have here, is the West German institutions, the rule of law and good practice, even more, I would say, than the West German money. And yet, I was watching the Anti-Velvet Revolution on YouTube again this weekend. And when you see this enthusiasm, this energy that demanded nothing else but to be mobilized for a good cause, you cannot but have faith. From the numerous oral history interviews I listened in the past decade, I can say that the civic potential for finalizing the revolution is still here and is still waiting to be mobilized. To lead a proper policy of dealing with the communist past from the bottom up rather than top down, that is, not by telling people what they should think, but by actually asking them what they do think, is one way to start. That is why I supported the creation of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes as an institute of national memory, and this is why I participate to it to the best of my ability. Thank you.